Our organizers here, we have John Chapman doing the video, Jennifer Scroggins and Mohammed Abuzar, who are not here. They host the study group, which is on the third Sunday of every month. We have our speaker today is, our speaker organizer is Ryan, who's also our speaker today. I am the sponsors coordinator filling in for Ian, who couldn't be here tonight. So we have a code of conduct for the meetup. It's pretty simple, just we're dedicated to providing a harassment-free learning experience for everyone, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, age, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, religion, technology choices, or anything else. Just be good to each other. Our sponsors today for both location and food is Atomic Object. And Jarek, if you want to say a few words about.
Sure. Yeah, so I work at Atomic Object. I've been here for about 2.5 years, going on 3 this summer. It's been a great experience. We get to work on a bunch of really different, interesting projects. I've worked on simulators for cars. I've worked on some projects for a major airline, and a bunch of different things. And really the technology stacks are broad and varied. Desktop apps, web apps, embedded apps. It's been a great experience. We work on small teams. We're really self-led and self-directed. And you get to interact very directly with your client, not hidden behind bureaucracy. And it's been a fantastic experience. If you're interested, you're looking for developers actively. We have some contact cards available, kind of spread around tables, where you come talk to me. My name is Jarek, as mentioned earlier, and our offices are here in Ann Arbor, if you didn't notice. All right, thanks.
Awesome. Give a round of applause for Jarek and Atomic Object. All right. So there is a new meetup here, the second Monday of every month. Next month, we are going to have a talk on Vue.js, View from the top. Doug Lance is going to be giving that talk. We're always looking for speakers. If you want to give a talk here, feel free to email us at speakers@semjs.org. And you don't have to do a full-length talk. If you want to do some kind of shorter lightning talk, we'll also do those instead. And then we have the SemJS study group, which is the fourth Monday of every month. This is kind of an informal gathering where people just get together, talk about JavaScript, help each other with personal projects, and that's going to be February 24th at Ithaca. Other meetups we have going on around the area, Rochester Full Stack is tomorrow. That is the second Tuesday of every month. Tech Inclusive here in Ann Arbor, that's also tomorrow. We have AWS Michigan on this Thursday, and Detroit Node coming up next Tuesday. Are there any other cool events in the area that anyone knows about, would like to share?
Yeah, on the end of the month, on the 25th, here at Atomic Object, we're going to take a look at black box acceptance test automation using Ruby Water. Again, this can be acceptance test automation, but a lot of it's being used by companies implementing SaaS-based applications with a 3-month deploy cycle. They want to try and make sure that their app works properly in their environment, so they're using this type of automation. So again, that'd be on the 25th of this month. Also, I'd like to invite you up to the Flint Tech meetup, downtown Flint, on the same block as the first GM factory. It happens, I believe, every third Monday. They have a more diverse mix of topics there, so you might find that interesting. It's just straight up 23, little jog over on 69 downtown. Like I said, it's in what's called Factory 2, which I'm told is where they used to build all the ambulances for World War I. So a little bit of history there as well.
Awesome, thank you. And then finally, if you're looking for a job, we have a jobs board here at SemJS. You can send email to jobs@semjs.org with some information about yourself, and we'll try to get you in touch with some companies that are looking to hire developers like you. As always, our post-meeting analysis, we usually gather up, go over to MASH, which is about a block or two away from here. We usually just grab a drink, talk about, you can meet the speaker. Are you going to make it out, Ryan?
Yeah, I'll be all right.
You can talk to the speaker if you want, usually, and just, talk about stuff. And without further ado, our featured talk, Ryan Lesino.
Close, yeah.
You might not need Webpack.
If anybody needs the bathrooms, they're either this way to the right or back where you came from and to the left. They're in the hallway right over here.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Brandon. So yeah, tonight I want to talk about kind of the overall concept of bundlers and kind of where we are today, how we got there, and some things that we might be able to do in the future and even today. So if you can spell my last name and you're interested, you can follow me on Twitter. How I pronounce it is Lanciaux, but I've been told by people who are native French speakers that I totally butcher that. So. So don't take my word for it. But yeah, tonight we're going to talk about this. So if you're wondering what I look like, there's my picture. But really into software, obviously, in the developer community. I'm here. I love stuff like this. I really like coffee quite a lot. It's kind of fun because I'll give conference talks sometimes, and when I say the coffee thing, sometimes it gets cheers more than a talk. And as a hobby, I like doing music production. Don't have a ton of time for that these days. Here's my wonderful family. I have 4 kids. They're not always dressed in ballet outfits, but this was their ballet recital last year. I'm very, very big on remote work. Who here also is big on remote work or enjoys remote work? Awesome. So most of the time I work from my house, and I have kind of an office kind of separated from everything. But there was one time recently where my kids were home and I was the only one with them, and I was doing a video call, and my 2 oldest are super, super considerate about not interrupting video calls. And at the time, my 6-year-old also knew how to send emails, and I received this for the other that was learning how to use the bathroom. So yeah, that was a fun email to receive. But yeah, we're not here to talk about that tonight. So we're going to start off with an example because we're going to go through a bit of content. But just out of curiosity, who's using Webpack at some level in some kind of application? Awesome. Yeah. So Webpack is awesome, and there's a lot of things that we can do with it. But just a real quick example here. So how often do you run something to build your application, right? Like something that kicks that off. Like happened in about a second and a half. This is hello world. So if I go over here to localhost 8080, hello world. We have like just a very, very small thing going on. So do that again. Now start. Do some bundling. And there, we're there. So this is using the Vue CLI. Pretty straightforward. But what I want to talk about later today is something called Snowpack, something that we can use instead of Webpack. And so if I type yarn start here, to start my application, this could be npm run start or whatever we're saying to start our application. We're done, just like that. Oops, that was the wrong thing. So starting this off really well. All right, so just like that, it's done. This is using Snowpack. So this is a second and a half versus like almost nothing for hello world. But what happens when you start adding more files to your projects?
Much slower.
Yeah, and with Snowpack, as we'll see as we go a little bit later, that same thing doesn't really happen as much. So, so a brief thing there. But so generally, when I talk about our new technology or examine a new technology for myself to say, is this something that I want to use? I usually like to have some frame of reference to say, okay, why am I here? Why am I examining this thing even? So one of the first things I want to talk about is just like web development from a while ago. So this background I thought was kind of funny because it had like people using stone tools and things like that. And sometimes in web development, things that happened just a few years ago feel like forever ago. And so when I started out, I don't know if you have a similar experience, I was building websites like this. I was including CSS, I was including JavaScript through script tags, and I had to make sure this was happening at the end of the right before the closing body tag, because I didn't want to make things slow. Lots of people are still doing this successfully. This is not a critique on that at all. But this is how I started out. There was no tooling, and I had to be very careful. There were some challenges here, because does anybody else have experience where you would include a script tag and it would block the rendering of your DOM because you were including too many things were happening, too many network requests were happening? Or I used to use a lot of jQuery. Sometimes I would include a script that would try to use jQuery before I loaded jQuery. And so things happened where it's like, oh goodness, I need to make sure I'm handling this in the right order and the right way. So kind of alluded to before, browsers have a maximum simultaneous connection, number of connections that we can use. For Internet Explorer at the time, it was 6, so that was fun. And I know other browsers had different amounts, like Chrome had a lot more, but it's like, why is something taking so long in Internet Explorer? And it's like, well, because I'm loading 20 JavaScript files, and it's loading them in batches of 6. So that was fun. Until bundling came onto the scene. This has been around for a while, but I started using it in applications probably 9-10 years ago. We'd say, okay, we're gonna, probably a little less than that actually, but we're gonna say, okay, we're gonna combine all our JavaScript files into one JavaScript file. So we can avoid that 6 max connections. So that was one way to get around that. There were lots of different types of bundlers. There were some even that were baked into ASP.NET. So it was kind of like, oh, your ASP.NET thing will bundle your JavaScript and your CSS for you. Kind of nice. And then also minification, just to make things go a little bit faster. And that's where we would say, all right, we're going to change all our variable names to single characters, remove all this white space and comments, and make the payload a little bit smaller. If you care more about that, you can go to the docs.microsoft.com thing down here. For this bundling and minification article from 2012. It's probably not what you're looking to do right now. And then browser support. So this was another challenge before some of the tooling that we're going to talk about today. I don't know how many times I've encountered this. Maybe you have experience with this as well. But a number of times I would write something, test it in Chrome, totally fine, go to test it in Internet Explorer, and not so much. And it was because I was using things that weren't supported. Often there would be things like polyfills or shims to say, all right, I want to make this browser that doesn't have this language feature behave like it does. But that was something that was really hard to mitigate. So script order, we already talked about that. So a lot of tools and frameworks came on the scene. And I know there were other things and ways that we could solve some of these problems that we might encounter. But around the time that I started using Angular and React is kind of when some other tooling came onto at least the apps that I was building to help mitigate some of these problems. So is anybody familiar with this one here, 6 to 5? Yeah, so at the time, I wanted to convert modern ES6 JavaScript to ES5 that would run in older browsers. You might be more familiar with the more recent name of Babel, but it used to be known as 6 to 5, which if you've been staying up on your ECMAScript language versions, 6 to 5 wouldn't scale very well because we're coming up on ES 2020. So Babel was, we'll just refer to it as Babel from here on out instead of 6 to 5. This one was game changing for me because I could avoid those shims and stuff altogether, which was really nice. Also, just a total aside, does anybody know the history of this tool? There is a JavaScript developer from Australia, and before he was really big into development, he was in high school. He wanted to learn JavaScript, so he thought, I'm going to build this tool to translate the more modern JavaScript back to older versions of JavaScript. And I don't know about you, but like when I was picking up a language like JavaScript, I was doing like tutorials and like videos and stuff like that. Not like I want to figure out how to translate stuff from one to the other. So that is like super impressive. But this kind of revolutionized how front-end apps were built, at least for me. But there was still some problem with kind of this bundling. Anybody used any of the tools on this screen besides NPM? Yeah. So I've used all of these top 3 for building applications into a single JavaScript payload. So this is Grunt and Gulp. They're kind of task runners to say, bundle our code, minify it, do it in this order, so on and so forth. And then even like make files that we'd use in other languages. And then we have like package managers. So this is Bower and NPM. The one that I think a lot of us have ended up using is NPM. But for the websites, this was a challenge at first because a lot of times packages for Node were written in a way that were specific to Node. And so we had to do something to translate them into a browser. So there were tools like Browserify, things that would say, okay, I'm taking this common JS module and turning it into something a browser can understand. And there were a number of these types of things like UMD, AMD, and CommonJS, and different tools to kind of translate things around. So something that we could use. But kind of dealing with this tooling and all these things to say, okay, I just want to run this third-party library in the browser can be kind of exhausting. And at least in my experience, no 2 project was configured the same way. Okay, this one's using Grunt, this one's using Gulp, this one's using Browserify and all this other stuff, and just kind of like, oh my goodness. But thankfully, Webpack came about and kind of helped cut through some of that confusion and some of the chaos, at least in my perspective. So Webpack, for those that aren't familiar, is a bundler, but it's kind of a bundler that has kind of dominated this space. And it has a lot of nice benefits that we'll kind of look at a little bit, but one of them is it builds a dependency graph to say, here's all my dependencies. It knows about how your app is structured and can figure out the import order that we were talking about earlier. Also, it can help like eliminate code that you're not using. So if you're importing a bunch of stuff and it's like, oh, well, you're not using this, it's just gone from the bundle. It has a lot of users, which I always look for, not as a final say in what technologies I'll use, but a lot of times when a library has more users, usually that one gets some better documentation or better tooling around it. And yeah, it's well documented, and there's a lot of benefits to this one. So this is from just like the Webpack documentation page. We're saying, all right, we have all these types of files. We have our JavaScript, some graphics, and Sass files for styling, and through plugins and loaders and so on and so forth. It goes through Webpack and comes out as a production application. Okay. So yeah, lots of plugins. And a lot of the framework starters use Webpack. So Create React App uses Webpack. Vue CLI uses Webpack. Angular. I mean, a lot of the ones that are primarily used are using Webpack. But there's some problems or perceived problems with that sometimes. So Create React App. If we use that, we get 200 megabytes of dependencies just by default. And behind the scenes, we get 600 lines of Webpack configuration. Now, thankfully, that's abstracted away for us, or sometimes not thankfully. I don't know if you've ever had that where you're like, oh no, now I need to eject my React app to do some configuration or do something to get into the configuration. But that can cause some challenges there, and might cause us to question some things if we see 200 megs in our node modules just to do hello world. Okay. So it has a perceived level of complexity. I will say that there's a disclaimer here. Webpack has a lot of zero config type things that work really well, but there is this perception sometimes that, hey, this is really hard to work with. kind of push back on that, but I think this tweet's funny, so I'll show it up here. And then along with that complexity, sometimes people just get overwhelmed by all the things that you're doing to get something loading on a browser, right? So, sorry, this talk is mostly other people's content. And just, I think a lot of people long for this simplicity that things used to have, while still having the flexibility and power that we're able to achieve today with some of the tooling that we have. So there's some other bundlers that have come up recently to kind of get back to the roots a little bit as far as how things look like, as far as, okay, I have an index.html file and I'm including some JavaScript and some CSS. And so like roll up and parcel. Has anybody used any of these? Yeah, awesome, very cool. So for parcel, for instance, we could globally install it just with npm or yarn. We don't have to globally install it either, but for this example, it's global, so. And then we would have a component that's just a really simple like hello world React component. So we just say hello, we're receiving name as a prop, and we're rendering that back out. In another component, we'll say react.dom.render, our component with a name of everyone. And then we'll do the document.getElementById main, we'll render that into that element. And we'll have a pretty simple HTML file. Looks a little bit like the first one that we were seeing here. We're just going to include our script right before the closing body tag, and then we're going to say import index.js. Now, we can run parcel against our index.html file. So instead of like a yarn start, I mean, we could write that as the script in our package.json. And it just says, hey, look, your server's running, and it built the thing. But this is still a bundler. So some of the challenges that people have encountered with the file sizes and some things like that might still be a problem. Now this kind of eliminates a lot of the complexity, but there's some edge cases that you can bump into that might bring some complexity back in. And some of the things that we're saying around like page speed and, when I save a file, it still has to bundle the application to get it into something that I can see. So a lot of times, instead of saying, okay, I just want a faster bundler, how can I make my bundler faster? Sometimes it's a good idea to think about, how can I reframe this thing into like what I'm actually trying to get at? So instead of saying, can I make my bundler faster, which is a good ideal to have, it's like, what am I actually trying to get? So I want to get something that's more simple and really fast. So there's a there's a story about Disney World. If you, who loves lines at amusement parks? So I think it's a common thing where people don't typically love lines at amusement parks, and so Disney World was encountering this problem and trying to say, okay, how do we make people not frustrated that people were frustrated that the lines were long? And it's like, okay, how do we get around this? And so it's like, well, we can't really make the lines move faster because there's only so much of the ride. So what people eventually came up with is to say, well, if we make the line part of the experience of the ride, people might be happier while they're in line. So they kind of reframed the problem into saying, instead of making it faster, how can we make people happier while they're in line? There's some other techniques too that they did. So I think we can do the same thing. We can say, instead of making a faster bundler, like let's take a step back and think, what is it we're really trying to do? When I'm developing a website, I want like as near instant feedback as possible. I want things to just happen for me, and I really don't want to spend a lot of time configuring it. If I'm building an application, I want to build like application code, not configuration code. Like obviously that stuff's very important and has a profound impact on our apps, but if I could, in a perfect world, I wouldn't have to configure it. It would just do it for me. So we were talking about like the history of web development, and that kind of has a lot to do with why we bundle things today. But are we still there? Do we still need to bundle things? Do we still need to use these strategies to say we need to push all our files into one? Sometimes we do, and that's perfectly good. But other times it might be just something that we're doing because we've always done it. So what can we do to like get this world without bundlers? Right. So traditionally, one of the things that we've been kind of encumbered by is the HTTP protocol. So with HTTP, we're opening up like a TCP request at a time for every item. Again, browsers can do some of them asynchronously, some of them happening at the same time, but we've still had that, okay, we're opening up a stream, getting some data back. HTTP2 is a newer technology that we can use that has some benefits. So this is from the HTTP2 docs. It's binary instead of textual, so it's easier to like process and parse through. And it's fully multiplex, so we can do things in parallel. So instead of saying, all right, I have to load this thing and this thing and this thing, it's just we can just start loading all the things, which is really cool. There's some other things that it does really well, but yeah, the biggest one I want to focus on is the parallelism. And just to kind of show where things are at, if you're looking to use Opera Mini, you might be out of luck, but a lot of them support this protocol today. And if you see up here, it says this originally started from the Speedy protocol. Is anybody familiar with that or have used that? Yeah. So it's kind of neat to see some things that were kind of more less widely adopted. That is weird saying it more less widely adopted, but things that were less widely adopted kind of turning into this. So this is one thing that makes it a little bit less likely that we'll need to bundle. But also, we can cache our things pretty well. So we can use e-tags to load our resources. And what this will let us do is it has a token to say if my file has been modified, and it has a timeout. So it says, you know, if this age has been hit on the timeout on the cache control max age, we will want to actually go get this content again. But what will happen is, otherwise it'll use the token and say, is my file modified? And the server will respond with a 304 and say, no, this has not been modified, so I don't need to get this again. So instead of having this scenario where I'm hoping to load like a giant file and to help kind of speed things along, we can say if I have many files that my browser's loading using HTTP2 and caching, I know that my files I won't be constantly loading like all my JavaScripts over and over and over again. So if I change like a part of an application, I can be pretty confident that it's only getting that one part again if I'm caching appropriately. This requires that your server also supports e-tags, so just something to be aware of. And then service workers, which is unfortunately a bit outside the scope of this talk. But people are doing some amazing things with that as well, to kind of provide like app-like experiences, like native app-like experiences, and kind of handling caching. And then one of the things that I mentioned before is the browser supporting various implementations of JavaScript has been kind of rough in the past. Recently, that's been getting a lot better. And one of the things that kind of really stands out is using the ES module imports and exports. So most browsers support this now. So this is from Kent C. Dodds' blog. What we can do is say, we can say import this append div from this file, and then we can use the function. And we can do it in HTML as well. So one thing to notice here is that we have this .js extension. So a lot of times we would just say import this JavaScript file without the extension, and it knows what to do. We do need that, and we'll see that in a bit more in our examples here in a second. So one other thing.
If I recall correctly, your web server, the browsers are very picky about the MIME type that's returned, the content type. on that file, but is that true
I,
still?
I believe so, yeah. And one other thing to call it, I guess, that while we're here is we have this type as module as well. Where before we could just say, import this thing as JavaScript and didn't really care as much, but yeah, we probably want to do that as well. Okay. One other thing is, in Create React App and some other like view scenarios, I would use import style syntax to import images or import like CSS. That won't work here. So this is purely for JavaScript at this point that we're doing the import and export. Okay, so I still want nice things. So I can use like ES modules now. Like we can all use those for the most part. But there's still this problem of like, okay, how do I get my stuff from NPM that I want to use, just third-party things, and get them into my app without using a bundler? And this is where Snowpack comes in. Snowpack is kind of like a bundler because it helps you kind of translate your code into something that the browser understands, but it kind of does it at a different time. So it does not do like actual bundling. So when I hit save on my JavaScript file, it doesn't know about it, doesn't care, doesn't do anything with that. So it makes it pretty fast. Most of the time there's little to no build step, and it runs only on install. And this is what is kind of the magic of it, is it does it one time. So if I install a module, I'll say, okay, Snowpack, do your thing, and it'll make things, it'll kind of do a bundle step there. So this is what we want to dive into, is it does all its work at install time. So say we were installing Preact, for instance. Does anybody use Preact frequently? Yeah. So we install it from NPM. It comes from the registry into our node modules directory. When we run Snowpack, it'll make a new directory called web modules and translate our node modules to web modules. This works for anything that is an ECMAScript module. And this is what we can do to use Snowpack. So instead of importing things from node modules, we'll import them from web modules, as we'll see here. So let's say we have a Preact example. We're going to install both Preact and a thing that's a little bit like JSX called HTM. We'll use that in our view layer to power like our HTML. And then we run npx snowpack. So npx will let us run a CLI tool from the node package registry, basically. So we don't even need to like yarn install Snowpack to use it. So we say npx snowpack, and it says Snowpack did some stuff. And if we look at what's inside this web modules now, we have a new file for those two items that we installed. So we have Preact and HTM. We also have an import map, which helps in some browser cases with how to import things. It's not necessary directly, and we're not going to talk about that too much tonight. But the main thing that we want to look at is we have HTM and Preact under web modules. So we can build an HTML file, kind of like we've been seeing so far. Again, we're including our script type equals module and source/app.js, and we're going to create that file next. And we'll look at this live example here too in a second. So notice where normally we would import something from like just Preact. We say import this, H and render from Preact. We're actually saying import it from web module /preact.js. And that kind of corresponds to the ES module stuff we were talking about. So we got it, we installed it into node modules, we ran Snowpack, made web modules, and now we can import it into our file here. Okay. And then we have a Preact, like just kind of hello world type component. Again, we're focusing on the Snowpack stuff and not so much like a fancy Preact thing. But we're rendering an H1 with a color, it has a color of red, and it just says hello world. And then we're rendering that out. Okay. So normally we would have like a yarn start or something. We can create that, but we would use it. We would use a server tool, kind of like this one here, server, where we would say, just watch my files and reload on changes. So And again, we're going to use npx, which allows us to run a CLI command from the node package registry. And we get something like this. And we're actually going to flip over and see the real thing here. All right, so I'm going to start this. I made a yarn start command, so you didn't have to watch me type npx run server, because I don't do live demos, and I would fail even at that. Yarn start's about the best I can do. So if we flip back to our browser here and look at localhost 8080, so you get this hello world, right? So we have our server running down here. It started almost instantly. And that was the server piece starting, not actually anything with our code. So check this out. Blue, green. So this is all running just with Snowpack. And you notice there's nothing happening down here. It started the server once and it's happy. That's all it needs to do. So traditionally with another paradigm we might see, okay, I'm building my things again, or I'm building this file that changed and kind of hot reloading the things. This is totally just the browser and what's already been accomplished with Snowpack doing the work. Okay. All right, so I don't know if you're anything like me. I use React quite a lot. And React has something that I also use called JSX. So who uses React and JSX? Yeah, awesome. So I love JSX, but it has a downside. It has some trade-offs here. JSX looks like HTML, but it's not HTML. It's JavaScript. If you tried to ship JSX to a browser, it would just be like, "What are you doing?" Like, it wouldn't know how to handle it. So when we're using something like Snowpack with React, we still have to use Babel. So instead of saying, this just works like we saw with Preact, where we had a string that was kind of responsible for handling our HTML, we're going to use Babel to translate JSX into HTML. So if we were to start a new project here, we would add Snowpack. And I know so far I've been saying we're going to run it from npx, because we won't need to install Snowpack. When I'm using React with Snowpack, there's actually a Babel plugin that Snowpack ships with Snowpack that is really nice for some reasons that we'll see in a second. And then I'll say add Babel core, Babel CLI, and Babel preset React. Create a Babel RC file. This is kind of how we can configure Babel. Say we're going to use the Snowpack plugin initially, right there, and Babel preset React to just say, Babel, this is something that has React in it, and Babel, configure Babel to use the presets that will make it function well with React. So this will do our JSX transformations for us. All right, this is where it gets kind of interesting. So we're going to add React, and we're using an alias here. So React does not ship with ECMAScript by default. And so there's some community ones that have a version of React that supports ECMAScript. We'll run yarn Snowpack, and we'll see, hey, it did some stuff. And similarly, if we ran like an ls command on the web modules, we'd see React and React DOM have a version now that we can import from web modules. All right, so that install alias thing, the first time I saw it, I was like, yeah, I'm probably not using this. But it's actually just, there's a community version that is an ES module of React instead of the way that it's shipped currently. It's a pretty long-running GitHub issue on the React repository about supporting ES modules. So at some point, if that gets resolved, you can use Snowpack with React directly, but if that's something you're interested in checking out, you'll need to use this alias now. So it's just saying, when I refer to React, actually go to the organization, React ESM, and get React. And same thing for React DOM. We can run npx snowpack again, or yarn snowpack to get this. And yes, these two slides are out of order. And then we can start building our React components. So this hello world one, we have app equals h1 hello everyone. Then we're using React DOM.render. So if you recall what I said before, we were importing from /webmodules/react.js and /webmodules, or for preact. We had to add webmodules, preact, and then append the .js file. If we're using the Snowpack Babel plugin, it does this for us. So it's actually rerouting to the web modules behind the scenes, but it lets us import React in a way that we would normally be doing. So if we were using the Preact example again, and we were using this Babel plugin in Babel, we could say import these things from Preact instead of webmodule/preact.js. Then we go and say we want to have some HTML that we want to be kind of the container for our app. Like all the other examples, we have a script tag towards the bottom, but instead of saying import this source file from source/whatever, we're actually saying go to this lib directory. Okay. So the reason that we want to do that is we're running this Babel step now. So we're going to say run Babel and output everything that's been run through Babel into this lib directory and watch for changes. And then we'll run the server reload again. Okay. Normally what I do when I have to run the two commands together is I'll either write a script that'll happen in yarn start, or I'll use a tool called concurrently to say do this and this at the same time. But usually for the sake of example, I like to call out a little bit more clearly, like we're doing two things here. It's not just one step, but we're saying watch Babel and run the server. So we can actually see that in action. It's not too profound, but if we go into package.json here, I have a start script that says concurrently run Babel and start a web server that's watching for changes. Okay. All right. So if I run yarn start now, it's running both of these things, and it's saying it's serving here on this. All right, and there we have it. It's kind of what we expect. So if I go in here and change this to maybe. We'll pretend that worked. It works like 9 times out of 10. Or, no, I think I just have something misconfigured in my package.json or something. But what'll happen is, since we're running Babel with a watcher and the server with a watcher, it'll fire these both off, and should cause that to. There we go. So my live server reload isn't working right now, but when I hit refresh, it worked. So I guess that's something to verify, is to make sure that you're actually running the reload part of your server. And there's a handful of these like live server type things that you can use. This is just the one I happen to be using right now. All right, so who here uses TypeScript? Awesome. Who here is avoiding TypeScript? And who here is using TypeScript but used to be avoiding TypeScript? Yeah. I don't know, I found that it's kind of taking over everything. And it's it's a tool that I think I've seen a lot in like just the front end ecosystem. It's pretty useful. So this is another thing where it might be kind of like, okay, how do I use this with something that's not actually a bundler? Well, we already have Babel installed, so there's a plugin for Babel that just says, yeah, use TypeScript. So that's all we really need to do. So Snowpack comes from this other like overarching project called Pika. Snowpack used to be called Pika Web. Pika has this kind of philosophy of saying, look, we can kind of get out of the way we've been doing stuff for building web apps, and it's pretty interesting. If you get the time, I'd highly recommend checking this out. This is the Pika site. So they have a CDN that kind of mirrors what's in NPM, but for ES modules. And then you see here we have Snowpack, which we've been talking about a little bit tonight. But there's a lot of interesting stuff here. There's even like a code editor, which I haven't used yet, because I'm like, I like my VS Code. Even though you might have noticed I was using Vim tonight, it's a little easier to jump around quickly while doing demos. But yeah, there's a lot of exciting things here, and I think there's a lot of neat stuff that it can do. One of the things that's really interesting is I've been seeing more of the Google developer advocates and people who kind of promote the web platform, saying like you should pay attention to this Snowpack stuff. Like there was a discussion going on recently about somebody was like, I'm starting a new project and what should I use? And they were kind of being directed to look at using Snowpack a bit, which I thought was pretty interesting to see that from some Google folks too. So when not to use this kind of stuff. So if you have something that's working already today and you're not really encountering a lot of pain, it's probably a good indicator that you shouldn't be changing things. Also, as you saw, this is still pretty new. So I probably wouldn't be building a React application for production using this right now, just because I'd be using the non-official ES module version of React. But for other libraries, it's there and working pretty well right now. The Svelte support too, if anybody's using that, seems pretty good. So, love to take any questions that you have on this. Yeah.
So if you use the Babel plugin where you can meet your imports like they normally are, does that mean, say, you could like add it on a project, they work on with a team, and you could use Snowpack and other people could use the project the same way?
That's a very good question. Let me think about that for a second. I'd have to try that. That might work, and that might have some potential.
Yeah.
I know one of the core philosophies of the project too is like if you find you need to move off of Snowpack, like they don't want it to be like you're locked in. It's kind of like you can use this stuff while you want to, but then it's like I'm going to add Webpack now because I need to do this, this, and this with images or whatever else you might need. So yeah.
So in terms of migrating, let's say if I wanted, we know React is currently working on, well, I should say there is an open PR for adding ESM support to, or adding a distribution of it. Is there a way that you can sort of convert existing modules over to that, or is there any tools around that? Because I know I tried installing it, I think Moment somehow doesn't have one, which is another kind of surprising exclude from that, considering I think that isn't, like, it's not React specific, it's pretty browser generic. So framework generic, so.
Yeah, I think a lot of the ones that have like traditionally like common JS, like node type support, I think maybe have a little bit more trouble with that sometimes, but I think what you could do is almost the same kind of thing that they're doing with the React one, where there's like a wrapper around it to make it an ES module. So. Yeah.
Is it compatible with NPM Link?
That is not something I've tried. I think it would be based on how it works. So it kind of looks at the node modules, looks for ES modules that you're using, and then makes web modules out of that, if I'm saying that correctly.
So would it, like, you think it maintain the symlinks? Well, I guess it compiles them onto a single JavaScript file?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, that's a good question. So like, I mean, one of the things that it is doing is almost like a traditional bundler step, but when you run that npx Snowpack. So I think that would work just like any other bundler that you npm linked with.
But it's not watching your node modules folder, right? It's like, well, you do that one time to compile the web modules.
Yeah, so
So every time you modify something, it's npm linked in your node modules, you have to rerun.
you'd have to run the npx snowpack again, yeah.
Okay.
So that's normally something I'll put in like a package.json prepare command or script, and then that'll happen anytime you do npm install. But you can run the npx snowpack whenever you want to, also in those scenarios. But yeah, I don't know that it would watch unless you set something up to do that.
Oh, I remember my question. So it's not tree shaking, right? It can't actually remove unused code. So have you looked at the overall size difference in first time request for like a simple React app?
Yeah.
How much usually gets shaken out?
Yeah, so actually this is something I should have put in here. It does handle tree shaking.
Well, how does it do that? If it doesn't know what's getting used.
There is a command that you can run to optimize.
Optional.
Yeah, before you build for production. And it does use, so that rollup that we had a slide where like here's some other bundlers, it does use rollup to do some stuff, and rollup has really good tree shaking support. The main author of Snowpack has a really fantastic article on how it does the tree shaking, even because that's the thing that most people are like, how does this even do this if it doesn't? But yeah, if I understand correctly, when you do the command to build it for production, it'll handle the tree shaking. So yeah, really good question. But yeah, it's kind of interesting that it takes you back to this like frame of mind that was prevalent before, a lot of the frameworks and bundlers and other tools. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, I'll be around if anybody. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick, I was just thinking, like other post processors, like if you were using Sass or something like that, is that just another thing you're potentially going to add to, like concurrently?
Could be.
Or have you played around with that at all in terms of other nice things?
Yeah. So for Tailwind, so. I have some bias on things. A lot of times I use like style components or like a CSS and JS thing, and that works just fine. So they do have a section here on Sass. This is one of those things where I was like, I'll have to look this up and get back to you, but it looks like they are doing a build with a watch on your Sass files. So that's one of those things where if I was doing a lot of these, where it's like, okay, I'm watching this and this and this and this and this, then it's kind of like I'm almost to this point where I have a bundler again. Yeah, and that might be where I evaluate my usage of it, I guess.
It's a piece at a time, right?
It is.
Like, whereas with Webpack, it's everything or nothing. Is that most
You can kind of do piece at a time with Webpack too, but yeah, I think the benefit here is like if you're on board with that, where you're just saying, I know that I'm building something and I don't really care about this build step, or I know that I have some Babel and maybe some Sass, and I know that that's going to be less time than every time I save rebuilding everything possible. That's kind of when that might happen. Tailwind's another one that I use a lot, and it's pretty much directly just the Tailwind CSS defaults to get that up and running.
So like you said, maybe we just think differently, and Sass is a response to
something else that
difficulties
happened.
that maybe we've moved past.
Well, I'm not quite going there yet, but
CSS has variables now, right?
it does.
No nesting.
Just write your CSS and JS, that's not the.
Yeah, no, I'm not going there. Not saying that. Yeah, no. There's a lot of interesting stuff kind of still going on here. Like this was just 1.0 released, like I think in November maybe. So probably a lot more to come here. So cool. Well, I'll be around for any other questions, and thank you all very much.